Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's discussion on marijuana legalization, social and economic justice for all New Yorkers. My name is Charles King. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Housing Works and one of the founders of the New York State Harm Reduction Association. And I want to start, first of all, by thanking Naomi Harris Tolson, also from Housing Works, who has put together this evening's panel and is managing things behind the scenes. And Naomi, if you'll put up the slides, I'm going to take just a minute of your time for a commercial break to tell you about who we are. The Harm Reduction Association has been in existence for 2 years now. We are a membership organization, and our mission is to introduce and promote harm reduction in New York State as a scientifically based treatment appropriate for substance use disorder, as well as a lifestyle approach for people who use substances. Our vision is that we want to see established harm reduction as the preeminent scientifically based treatment modality for substance use disorder and the appropriate response for people who use drugs. We have a wide range of activities, including providing access to cutting-edge clinical and peer trainings rooted in harm reduction, advocacy for policies that make harm reduction the preeminent treatment modality across New York State, and to collaborate with partners working at the intersection of race, gender, and class to end the opioid epidemic. If you're interested in being a part of the New York State Harm Reduction Association, you can help further expand our work. We have a range of membership benefits. Naomi can flip this slide just to show you how inexpensive it is to be a part of this organization. I chair the advocacy committee of the association, and it's through the advocacy committee that we developed tonight's forum, which we are thrilled to be co-sponsoring with the Drug Policy Alliance. To tell you a little bit about the Drug Policy Alliance as well as Smart Start, I'd like to introduce Melissa Moore, who is the New York State Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. Melissa.
Great, thank you so much, Charles, and thank you to everybody who's here, zooming in with us tonight. And of course, thank you to the New York State Harm Reduction Association and to Housing Works as well for all of the work that you've done to put on this discussion tonight. We really appreciate it. So the Start Smart Coalition is comprised of organizations and advocates from across New York State who are dedicated to legalization done the right way, making sure that we are advocating for provisions that will reinvest tax revenue into communities that have been harmed by cannabis criminalization. And we'll talk through a lot more tonight of what that means. And also making sure that we're actually centering racial justice and economic justice as we're moving forward with our legalization policies as well. And just being responsible and being community-based around what we're moving forward. So it's a network of, I think at this point, we're well over 150 organizations. And it's everybody from civil rights groups and faith-based leaders to community-based organizations, folks who are engaged in harm reduction, and really everybody across the state, farmers, small producers, people who recognize that this is a moment when patients need better and more improved access because the medical marijuana program has been failing them since it was established. And we'll certainly talk more about that, as well as making sure that we're not seeing any ongoing criminal penalties within the framework for legalization, especially targeted at communities of color, and knowing that actually just today, new data was released around marijuana arrests in New York City in 2020, showing that during the pandemic, the arrests were still incredibly racially biased, with 92% of the people arrested for cannabis in New York City being Black and Latinx New Yorkers, despite the fact that we know the rates of use are very different. And then also making sure that we're centering, again, the resources and the budget going back into communities as a form of restitution. So with that, happy to get in a lot more into the details, but we know that this is, and part of the reason why we wanted to have this conversation tonight was because we know that there's a lot of discussion happening around marijuana reform in New York right now. Our neighbors in New Jersey passed through their ballot initiative in November and then passed their enacting legislation just a week or so ago. That was signed by the governor there, actually completing the process and turning into implementation there. And we know that Governor Cuomo has introduced legalization in each of his past 3 budget proposals in New York State. And there's the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act that's been pending in the legislature since 2013 and has seen a lot of the push from advocates now saying, pass the MRTA, folks might have seen that hashtag on social media. So we'll get in a lot more in detail tonight to what are the provisions that are actually on the table and why are we having these discussions?
Okay, thank you for all of that, Melissa. So before we ask our panelists to introduce themselves, just a couple of housekeeping guides for you. The chat is open and we want to invite everybody who's participating to feel free to join in the discussion and make comments in the chat. If you have a specific question for the panelists, I invite you to use the Q&A function on your screen. That'll allow us to more easily pull those out than just from the general discussion in the chat. Please, we hope that you're actively engaged in the conversation, and we're hoping to turn this into a fairly wide-ranging and freewheeling discussion. But right now, I'm going to invite our panelists to introduce themselves before Melissa poses the first question. And I'm going to start by asking Dr. Tanya Adams if she could introduce herself.
Yes, hi everybody. My name is Dr. Tanya Adams. I am a physician on Long Island, and I practice family medicine, lifestyle medicine, which is holistic approach to health and wellness using a traditional Western medicine approach. And I've been treating medical cannabis patients since the inception of the New York State medical marijuana program in 2016. And I've helped a lot of patients incorporate cannabis into their lifestyle, whether it's through the medical marijuana program or they're using cannabis in other ways. And I also practice some harm reduction in terms of treating patients with addictions to both alcohol and opioids and other drugs of abuse. And I've seen the benefits and the many benefits for patients incorporating cannabis into their wellness lifestyle, and also for treating certain conditions. And they generally do very well. It's very safe. We know that cannabis is not harm-free, but when the risk of the substance itself is lower than the risk of the laws that surround it, there's a problem. So we want to try and correct that, and I advocate for that for the wellness of all my patients, whether they're in the medical marijuana program or not. So I'm happy to help.
Okay, great, and thank you for being a part of this, Tanya. Nilan Natarajan, I hope I didn't massacre that name.
No worries. It's Nila Natarajan, and I'm a supervising attorney and policy counsel at Brooklyn Defender Services in our family defense practice. So Brooklyn Defender Services is a holistic legal defense provider for folks in Brooklyn. And specifically in the family defense practice, we represent and defend parents and caretakers who are facing allegations of abuse and neglect in family court, prosecuted by the state via Child Protective Services. And I'll go more into detail. I'm excited to speak to everyone about how marijuana legalization, we believe, will have a very positive impact on the communities we represent.
Great, thank you. And now Michael Gallapo.
Yes, so my name is Michael Gallapo. I'm a national consultant with the Urban Survivors Union, which is the National Drug Users Union I've also been involved as a staff member, working at various levels from co-production, event management, speaking, performing at the New York State Harvest Festival and Cannabis Freedom Rally, which is the longest running cannabis freedom rally on the East Coast. This is our 28th year that we're celebrating this year. And I've been a cannabis patient since approximately 2006, when I first encountered the state's program in California. I've been a program participant in a half dozen states, including New York. And cannabis has saved my life. Cannabis is a huge piece of my recovery. I was prescribed, I was taking about 13 different pills a day. I was able to come off of all of those prescribed medications with the help of cannabis, and I was able to stop smoking cigarettes. So drastic improvements in my overall global health and functioning, and that would not have been possible without cannabis. So thank you, everybody, for having me here.
Great. And last but certainly not least, Eli Northrop.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Eli Northrop. I'm a public defender at the Bronx Defenders, which is a holistic public defense organization based in the South Bronx. I'm also a member of the policy team at the Bronx Defenders in the criminal defense practice. We represent thousands of Bronx residents every year, not just in criminal court, but in family court, immigration, detention proceedings. We also have a civil practice, a social work practice. So I've seen how the marijuana laws have played out on the ground, how they affect our clients on a day-to-day basis across all these different practices, all these different systems. And I've also been a member of the Start Smart Coalition for the last 3 years, pushing to get the MRTA passed. I'm very excited to be here and to share whatever experience I have with you all.
Great. Melissa, you want to have at it?
Sure. So let's dive in and let's talk a little bit about, what is the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, because a lot of the rest of our discussion will be referencing that. And so I'd love if, Eli and Nila in particular, if y'all can lift up, what are some of the key components, from your vantage point, and given the criminal defense work that you're doing and the family defense work that you're doing, what are some of the the sort of top lines around the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act? We understand that it's a really long bill. It's a bit of a beast. It's extremely extensive, but it is comprehensive in that it brings in the medical marijuana program, the industrial hemp and CBD farming program that already exists at the state level, and then would add adult use legal cannabis to that. So can you clue us in a little bit about just what are sort of what's the framework within the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act?
Well, I can start off. I would say, when we talk about legalizing marijuana, it's not enough just to say, okay, it's legal now. There's a legacy of enforcement, disproportionate, racist enforcement of the marijuana laws. So when you think about having actual marijuana justice and legalizing marijuana in a way that provides for justice, it means going back and repairing past harm. And Melissa, you've referenced, the statistics on arrests even during 2020, but going back, last year, 2018, 2017, over 90% of arrests in New York City for marijuana were for people of color, despite the fact that people use marijuana at equal rates across races. And even statewide, I think it's something like 75%. So acknowledging that enforcement has not been even, you need to go back and repair past harms. And I think Nila can talk more about like the specific collateral consequences, but in terms of community investment of the tax revenue, one big part of the MRTA that the governor's proposal doesn't have and has never had is ensuring that money, tax revenue that's raised from marijuana sales gets reinvested in the communities that have been most harmed and most targeted for enforcement. The MRTA ensures that there is money that will go back on an annual basis to those communities, and that those communities will decide what to do with that revenue. MRTA also ensures that there will be opportunities for people who have been targeted for enforcement for marijuana to participate in this new economy. I mean, we have a lot of people who are experts in marijuana who, could get shut out if the governor has his way. So it's important that any bill that claims to be marijuana justice have these provisions. Now, there's also, with respect to criminalization, if you're legalizing a substance, it should be legal. You shouldn't have more crimes or crimes that have greater penalties. And the MRTA legalizes marijuana. It doesn't increase criminal penalties. We know if criminal penalties remain, they're going to be enforced disproportionately against people of color, Black and brown New Yorkers. So it's really important that when we legalize it, criminal penalties are eliminated. Now, even the MRTA has certain criminal penalties for possession of high level amounts, but the governor's bill, it lowers the amount at which a criminal penalty can be imposed. And in certain cases, certain driving offenses, for example, it actually increases criminal penalties. That's kind of like the broad outline. And I know Nilla knows about some of the collateral consequences as well.
Yeah, so when Eli talks about that, what's to me like so important about the MRTA is getting that revenue back to the communities that have been so violently harmed for decades due to the war on drugs, including marijuana, enforcement, quote unquote, criminalization. But we also know that those harms go beyond just getting arrested and having, served time, go through the criminal legal system. We know that convictions and arrests can impact people's ability to obtain and maintain public housing. In New York City, that would include any shelter housing. We know that criminal arrests and convictions can deeply impact people who are undocumented or otherwise in immigration proceedings. People can in fact be, deported against their will because of prior marijuana arrests and sentences, convictions. And we know that for the people that we represent in family court, that their marijuana use has deeply impacted their ability to keep their family reunited, or to keep it united or to reunite their families when they've been separated by the family regulation system or the child welfare system. And the MRTA, unlike the governor's legislation, actually affirmatively has provisions to address all of those collateral consequences through expungement mechanisms and through some specific law when it comes to family court.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nilla. And I just want to highlight for folks that, one of the things that I've really learned so much in this space is, if from family defenders like you and from folks who are really working on the ground, seeing day to day what the impacts of prohibition and enforcement disparities end up being. And I remember really clearly a couple of years ago when we were working with the city council around a package of bills, looking at what are the administrative consequences that the city has control over, even ahead of state movement around legalization. One of the things that was so impactful within those hearings was testimony from impacted parents, from young people who had been torn apart from their families, talking about the fact that it was in many cases just over allegations. There's no burden of proof even in so many of these instances, and yet, babies that were just a few days old were being taken from their mother's arms in this sort of misguided and very stigmatized conversation around supposedly what was best for the child, but not really having that be rooted in evidence or being grounded in anything that was actually demonstrably happening to the child. So I want to, with that, pass it over to Charles for the next question that I think is going to also pick up on some of the stigma conversation. Oh, we can't hear you, Charles.
This is what happens when you mute. You're not doing such a good job. So we do know that stigma continues to play a role in the marijuana legalization debate, and so I want to hear from all of you what you see the potential impact of this legislation on folk who are impacted by this stigma, and what are the consequences if we don't have any action? And for that, I think I actually want to turn to Tanya first to give us a perspective from the medical field.
So yeah, as a doctor for cannabis regulation, I forgot to mention that I'm the co-chair of New York chapter of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, and we're a group of physicians that look at the literature, and we're following the data, and we see that, you know, as I said in my introduction, the fact that cannabis is not legalized brings its own stigma. So if we just look at from a medical standpoint, what are the harms from cannabis? They're very minimal. Most people who use cannabis never become addicted to any drug, including cannabis. Most people who use cannabis use it responsibly. Much of the stigma comes from the legal perspective. And at one point, historically, for you know, several hundred years, cannabis was used by physicians. It was in the pharmacopoeia, and it was a readily accepted medication that was prescribed, but it was also just used by people around the world. It's very safely. It's got a long safety profile, and it's not harm-free, but it's the harms from cannabis are very, very minimal. So it really takes a shift in thinking about cannabis, that we've been thinking about it from as an illicit drug, and it's really a substance that we can use in a healthful way or potentially not healthful way, that can help us or harm us, but it helps us far more than it harms us, and the laws harm us far more than they help us. So just trying to strike a balance, and it's really asking people to use their own judgment and to think of this with a clean slate, because we've been codified into thinking that this is something harmful because of the law, and we need to rethink that, and we need to make a law that makes sense. And the fact that it's true that you can't just make it legal by a stroke of a pen and think that that's going to solve the problems either. We want to make sure that we have a system in place that fosters safety of use, and we want to make sure that we're addressing some of the concerns, because we do recognize that there are potential harms, so we can mitigate those harms and increase the safety and wellness of people at large. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be a medicine. It can just be a substance that's safe to use, and that's one of the reasons why I advocate for adult use. But we also have to recognize that there are some populations we need to be careful with, such as adolescents, we don't want people driving under the influence, but we already have these situations in society that we manage very well. So we have other medications and prescribed medications like benzodiazepines, like Xanax and Klonopin, that people take for anxiety issues, or opioids that they take for pain issues, and they go about their lives. And if they use those medications in a safe manner, they can conduct their lives and be safe. They shouldn't drive if they're under the influence and that they're intoxicated. But many people use those medications that are prescribed in a safe way, that they can drive and they're not intoxicated in any way. They're used to taking those medicines, and they can drive safely. So police can make some adjustments as to how they assess whether somebody's intoxicated or not. For instance, we can mitigate some of the issues with adolescent use by educating people about what's safe to use and what's not safe to use on the broader scale. So you look at cannabis as a drug or a substance that some people use, just as people use caffeine, nicotine, tobacco, alcohol, and other illicit drugs that have more detrimental use. And in that, when we look at it, if you look at it on a spectrum, and we're honest with adolescents, I think that they're going to trust us more. We tell them, listen, this is a safe drug to use if you're an adult or if you have a qualifying condition, an underlying condition. But adolescents who use cannabis do have a slightly increased risk of becoming dependent if they're using it on a regular basis. And underage use, children's brains are not fully developed until 21 to 26 years of age. Humans develop very slowly over time. So there are safer ways to implement use. And if we're honest with our people, our adolescents, our drivers, that they can be educated and use these substances safely, and they can also be a benefit to society at large. So, I think we just have to try and ask people to have an open mind and to dismiss some of their preconceived notions about marijuana as a drug, and think about cannabis as a substance that can be beneficial or potentially harmful, and depending on the way it's used and the way it's implemented. And so hopefully we can come up with laws that will support that, and that will also recognize some of the harms that have been implemented by these laws, and correct some of those wrongs. So that's what I'd like to see happen.
Thank you. So, Michael, I know that you have experienced stigma on many levels, and so I want to give you the next shot at responding to that question.
Yeah, so there's a lot of hidden harm, I think, to unpack, and my life story is so full of it. It's really hard for me to wake up on a given day and not face at least some measure of it. And my experiences with the discrimination and the treatment for cannabis use began when I was about 12 years old. So I wasn't even a teenager yet. And I was, put into an outpatient treatment program. I got put into a court system at a very early age because I lit up a joint in the parking lot of that treatment center. And as a result, I was placed into a residential treatment facility that was supposed to address my challenges or address my difficulties. And I posted an article in the chat that folks can, feel free to open and take a look at another time. But there are now dozens of named victims of people who are victims of sexual assault by the people who controlled this facility. And this was funded by the state. It was the children there were held in a prison-like environment. That's not what was represented to us at the time when this was being done. We didn't have a say in the matter. The court ordered this to happen. And so there was severe trauma that resulted from that. And so heading into my adult experience, I ended up going to California basically on an emergency family intervention. My mental health had completely fallen apart and nobody knew what to do. So they flew me out to California, where I found the state's medical cannabis program. It was actually there where I had my first experience of being incarcerated while volunteering at that medical cannabis program. That was actually during a time in 2006 when the federal raids were being conducted, and they took everybody who was working at the dispensary or volunteering and walked us out on a chain gang and held us incarcerated without charges or bail. And so by the time I left, I was homeless, and I spent many years of my life from that point forward chronically homeless. It took a long time for me to be able to recoup and get outside. I've actually gone to prison now twice for cannabis, both during times in which I was a licensed patient. And it's very bizarre for me to have conversations with prospective employers while I have felonies on my record. And now I get into these really uncomfortable conversations about my protected health information, because what we're talking about is my patient treatment that's been criminalized. And so I produce my medical marijuana card and I talk about my diagnoses. And then I have to wonder if the decision they made to hire me for a job or not hire me for a job was based on my criminal record or based on the liability that my diagnoses might present, or some other type of information they shouldn't otherwise be entitled to. And as somebody who works in the field, I graduated from an accredited school of social work while as a medical cannabis patient. It's not an indication that I can or can't perform at a certain level in society. There's certainly very rigorous supervision standards for folks graduating from post-secondary institutions to do service work. And yet my criminal record continues to be a barrier for me to be able to get employment in my field, for me to be able to even go back to my grandparents' home country and visit the Native American ancestral sites where my family has lived for many thousands of years. I can't even cross the border, and cannabis is legal in Canada. So there are enormous reparative harms, not the least of which are the prohibitions on people attending educational institutions and getting money for college. You can't get student loans. You're prohibited from certain forms of employment or getting licenses. So the list just goes on and on and on and on. And I deal with that on a day-to-day basis. I'm very blessed to have a robust support network and, people that provide me with opportunities, but I am very well aware that I am an exception. And the ongoing real intangible harm of my life, having my son be adopted and being raised by another family after dealing with the family court system that was not able to really accept my form of treatment. And ultimately they changed the law in the state that where my son lives, and I was going to family court. And I became the first patient in the history of that state to be put into the medical cannabis program by the drug court doctor out of medical necessity. That was the importance of my treatment. This wasn't something that was optional. This was something that I participated in. It should be a human right. There are many other people in the state of New York, just like myself, who should have an entitlement to this human right. Many of patients don't have the money to pay for treatment, and there's no current system of supporting them. So legalization could be an avenue to support the patient fees and support a means-tested access program for people like cancer patients who are literally at the very end of their life, just looking for some respite, really truly deserving of every measure of compassion that we can find. And this is just one of the many ways that we can start to address the many, many, many harms that have come from cannabis prohibition.
And Michael, I just want to note, this came up in an earlier conversation we had. OASIS, our drug treatment licensing agency, has moved considerably along the continuum from abstinence towards harm reduction, including mandating that even residential programs accept people who are on medically assisted treatment for opioids. But we still haven't evolved to the point where the same mandate exists for someone who is using marijuana medicinally and has it prescribed for that use. Before I turn it back over to Melissa, I just want to give Mrta and Eli a chance to jump in if you have any additional comment on this morass of stigma and how it impacts on people's lives.
I'm happy to jump in. I want to thank Michael for sharing, such a personal experience, and I know it's just so important to hear people's experiences. And what I can just add to that is, my office represents thousands of people every year, and we think we're in New York City and it's a progressive space, but the stigma around marijuana use is such that when getting into other issues, but when people in labor and delivery are drug tested without their consent, or their newborns are tested without their consent, and either test positive for marijuana, that often leads to a medical provider calling the state central registry and a child protective investigation beginning, and that can be incredibly harmful and invasive. We know that it means people are kind of coerced into signing releases for further medical or mental health information. Children spoken to without their parents being present. All of these greater harms of an investigation can start just from a parent or testing positive for marijuana, when we know there's really no medical reason to test a birthing person or a newborn child for marijuana specifically. And then what we see, I think, kind of what Michael was talking about, is when a parent and a child have already been separated for months or years due to maybe other concerns, legitimate or not, and then the issue of a parent's marijuana use comes to the surface through the ongoing state surveillance, that can become a reason. We've seen this in so many families, that can become a reason to prolong that separation or even make it permanent. And I think that is really about stigma. And I feel hopeful that the full legalization of marijuana can show people that adult marijuana use is a thing that people have been doing responsibly, but having the law reflect that it is something that can be done responsibly will go a long way to convince these state agencies, to convince judges that, you know, someone can be a parent and use marijuana safely and responsibly. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. Eli?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that a lot of the stigmatization has to do directly with the criminal laws and the criminal penalties, and who gets caught and arrested and convicted and who doesn't. And just to talk about the child welfare system, you know, you have literally mothers on the Upper East Side white people writing blogs about how cannabis makes them better parents. Meanwhile, you have families getting separated in the Bronx and in Brooklyn for the exact same behavior. And who's getting targeted by the system? When is it used as an excuse? It's not used to separate all families. So it just goes back to a system of state control. And I think we see this in marijuana, and we see this in a lot of other low-level law enforcement. But I do think that if you get rid of the criminal convictions, if you have a regulated system, going back to what Dr. Adams was discussing, you can actually, if you can regulate the substance, you can make it safer in a way. So I think legalization actually solves some of the problems that are reasons to not legalize. Usage rates are already high. People are using this substance. And I think getting rid of the criminal penalties, treating this like alcohol, treating this like cigarettes, which is how it should be treated, can get rid of a lot of the criminal penalties, which lead to all these other consequences that follow.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank all of you for sharing your perspectives on that. And I want to pick up on that thread of, acknowledging that use is indeed happening right now. I mean, prohibition has not been effective at curtailing people's use necessarily. It has certainly been effective at criminalizing and at causing harm to people. So as we're looking into a legalization framework, what are some harm reduction approaches that we should be considering? As we're transitioning from this kind of illusion of control under prohibition to actually being able to provide some education and some resources, bringing this out of the shadows and making sure that people are aware, as you were saying, Dr. Adams, of some of the risk profiles, but then also some of the other considerations that people should take into account. How could this impact, for example, addiction treatment services and some other harm reduction approaches there? And then I'll kick the second part of the question to some other folks, but interested in hearing from you, Dr. Adams, on some of those initial points, and then anybody else who wants to come in.
Yeah, so, with adolescents, we see that education reduces the use of tobacco and alcohol. And I would like to see that, especially with the MRTA, putting money into education, not just for cannabis education, but for all other illicit drugs that are more harmful potentially. And I think students will respect the fact that we're telling them the truth. They know that cannabis is safer than other hard drugs, but we're still classifying it as a drug. So if we tell them no, that it's not really safe for you to use illicitly because your brain is not developed, unless you have some kind of mitigating factor that makes the benefit for treating that thing, whatever that condition is with cannabis. Most adolescents shouldn't be using cannabis until their brain is fully developed. There are exceptions, as I said, to that rule. If we have a good legalized, regulated system, we can also mitigate some of the harms from that we might see, like, as I said, with drug trafficking or driving rather. You could also see that it would reduce. We see in states where cannabis is legal that we have reduced risk of opioid overdose and death, and that could be for a host of reasons. But we know that cannabis actually, people who simultaneously use cannabis with opioids generally use less opioids, so they're less likely to have an overdose. So there's a direct correlation there. And if we have better laws, we're going to see that people are, I mean, anybody who has social impact from cannabis use has a good chance that they're going to have their social determinants of health reduced. So they're going to have more challenges trying to find healthcare. They might lose their jobs, so they may lose their insurance, they might lose their housing. None of those things are good for health. We know that. Losing, children being separated from their parents, that's like one of the most traumatic things that can happen to a child. And that child is going to, even if it happens to a child as an infant, that can impact their life for the rest of their life, and they can have reduced outcomes for a host of other conditions. So we know that there's a lot of harm that can come from implementing either prohibition or laws that don't support healthy families and healthy communities. So hopefully we can come up with a system of laws that support that. And we can see with the MRTA, with reinvesting some of the, I'm certainly have nothing to do with government and fiscal, taxes and things like that. But if we have the proper tax structure, that we can support some of these programs. So we have educational programs that we have better laws that are not incarcerating people unjustly. I think we're going to have better outcomes, better health for our communities. Oh, you're muted.
That's exactly right. And I want to come to you, Michael, as well, and see if you want to, bring in from your personal experience and some of the advocacy that you've done as well. As Dr. Adams was talking about how, so often the sort of banner or the headline for so long was, supposedly marijuana is a gateway drug, but oftentimes we see, and what the research is panning out now is showing that in a lot of instances, it can be an exit drug from situations where people are using problematically in other areas. So just want to come to you.
Yeah, so there's a number of ways that works, and this is a really good place to highlight the importance of home and community gardening. One of the more valuable experiences in my recovery was while I was a patient in Rhode Island, and we have a home grow provision there, and the practice of like having to be responsible for something that took mindfulness and attentiveness on a daily basis helped me to keep to a routine. It helped me to stay engaged in the schedule. It helped me to stay active when sometimes I may have been struggling a little bit more with either my mental health or my physical health. And it helped me to engage with a community of other people that were interested in gardening. And that was a really big piece of my recovery that I think gets overlooked because we don't often talk about like the benefits of gardening and what people get from having a relationship with their plants and with their medicine. I'm able to grow strains that are specific and unique to my, unique condition and my unique biological needs. And I'm able to do that in a way that dispensary care has not been able to provide the kind of specialized care that really meets my individual medical needs. And there is patient-to-patient education that comes out. There are people who have been growing cannabis for many, many decades who have expertise that deserve to be able to continue to be a part of that community. It would be a huge loss, I think, for us not to consider that. And part of my experience in coming out of polysubstance dependence was in being able to use cannabis to come off of traditional pharmacotherapy. And I've seen that work really, really well for other people. My partner's little brother took over my garden. He's now a caregiver in the state of Rhode Island, and he's a methadone patient who struggled a lot with being successfully retained in treatment. And since he started gardening, he's been full of life. It's brought the family together, his father and mother, and involved in helping him to, manage his garden, and he's more active and has more self-esteem. He feels a lot of pride for what he's doing. And he's been really, really successful in his methadone treatment since that time. And now he's talking about, working on stepping down on his methadone treatment, coming off of methadone, in a very strategic way. And I think that these are long-term, whole health management strategies that allow an alternative, maybe for folks who haven't been particularly successful with the strict schedules of methadone treatment, and for whom buprenorphine doesn't work particularly well in order to be able to come off of an opioid or a pain medication. I know the fentanyl that's in the market now is highly lipophilic, and we've barely started to talk about how that, prolongs the precipitated withdrawal that people experience when they're trying to get inducted onto buprenorphine. And cannabis eases a lot of the difficulty with those symptoms. I know that the last 3 times that I was on prescribed opioids, I was able to use cannabis to stop taking the opioids. And that was successful for me to be able to manage my pain. I had a pretty invasive reconstructive face surgery so I could breathe better. And it was a really uncomfortable experience. And I would not have wanted to go through that experience without some kind of medication. But because I had cannabis as a fallback, I was able to take my medication for like 3 to 5 days. I was able to come off of it early. I was able to start using cannabis instead to manage my discomfort and my pain, and then eventually taper my cannabis use back to my once daily regimen at night, which is where I've been for many, many years. And it's been a stable strategy for me. It hasn't interfered with any of my function. We don't have settings where people are encouraged to participate in cannabis or be educated about its use as a recovery or a harm reduction tool. We don't have recovery housing much at all in New York State, and certainly no recovery housing that teaches people community gardening and brings people together around the plant and cultivation. And I think those are things that have enormous value in terms of, boosting positive outcomes, making sure that people who are from communities who have benefited from these resources being in the black and gray markets in those communities continue to benefit from the plant being in their community, and that they have an identity and a pride associated with that. I mean, I was really damn proud that the genetics and what we were producing in our garden was some of the best cannabis that I'd ever seen in my life. And there was something to be said for that. We as Americans, we value hard work. We value, people's ethic and getting up and doing something every day. It is not an easy task to grow and cultivate cannabis, but it's something that's very much aligned with our values. And it would be a missed opportunity for me not to mention that here, because so many folks in the activism community who have been here for decades advocating for this change would be very disappointed if this point wasn't raised, that all of them are in alignment with, that people want to be able to produce their own. I'm personally looking at buying property, and that's a motivating factor for me to pay property tax, so that way I can have land to cultivate my own cannabis in the privacy of my own home, and to be able to continue to express my liberties as an American citizen. So thank you all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what you raise is actually, again, one of the important points of distinction between what the governor's proposal includes and what's in the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, which does acknowledge that home cultivation is important. It's crucial for all of the reasons that you laid out. It's important in terms of affordability and access for patients, especially right now, as so many people are really trying to limit potential exposure and contact amid the pandemic. Being able to, stay safely at home, have, your personal plants that you're able to cultivate is vitally important. And then of course, having the strains and the actual plant science that connects the best and that is part of somebody's therapeutic approach for what they're grappling with. And Eli, I want to come to you as well on this question around harm reduction and thinking through some of the other points around consumption and where people might be able to use, because we also see this divide between what's in the governor's proposal and what the legislature has put forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a huge difference between the governor's proposal and the MRTA is that the MRTA provides for on-site consumption licenses. So a place that people can go and gather and smoke cannabis, which would be legal, just like a bar, some sort of club that would be a license where you could go and smoke cannabis. The governor's proposal doesn't have this, which begs the question, where is he expecting people to smoke? I mean, certain people can smoke in their homes, but if somebody lives in public housing, it's illegal to smoke there. If somebody lives in the shelter system, they can't smoke there. So if you're going to legalize a substance, you need to provide a space for people to be able to smoke it and consume it legally. especially because, the odor of cannabis, as we see right now, is constantly used as a justification to harass people, to stop people, to search people. And it also does, in fact, bother some people. So there should be places that are set aside, specific places, licenses, so that people can partake in a legal substance.
Can I just add, though, I want to point out there are other consumption methods besides smoking, and but still we need legal places to consume whatever that method might be. Smoking might not be the most medicinal way to deliver cannabis, although it shouldn't be eliminated as one choice. Smoking has its benefit because the onset of action is relatively quick, and it allows the patient to titrate because they can tell how they feel very quickly. So they can easily tell how much more medicine they need so that they can use the right amount. So that there's certain benefits there. But there are also other consumption methods. You can consume it orally in foods, or as a tea, as a drink, or it can be produced as a concentrate that could be an ethanol base that can be absorbed onto the tongue. It could be cooked into food products. So there's all different ways, different methods of consumption, smoking being one of them. And I noticed in the Q&A, while I'm on the subject, I just want to point out that compared to cigarette smoke, cannabis smoke does have certain carcinogens. When you light something on fire and it's the carbon from the fire that is causing some of those carcinogens, but cannabis actually has other properties that seems to reduce the risk of inhaling something compared to smoking, because people don't really develop lung cancer at the same rates. In fact, there's really no lung cancer associated with cannabis smoking, whereas there is lung cancer associated with tobacco smoke. So I just want to point that out.
So if I can jump in here and continue on this theme of distinguishing between the two different versions of legislation that we have, that we're looking at here in New York. One of the things that we've noticed, lots of states have gotten in front of us on this, and we ought to be able to learn from what we've seen happening in some of those states. And clearly in California, for example, you have a tax and price structure such that you you have two classes, right? You have the legal sellers and legal buyers, and you have the people who are still operating in what is effectively an illegal market. And so this leads us to questions about taxes, and not just how high the taxes should be, but also what is the purpose of those taxes? Is this about driving, balancing the state's general fund, or are there better ways to think about why we would tax this and what we would do with those dollars? And Eli, just because you're nodding the most aggressively, I'm going to jump to you first and then let other people chime in on this.
Sure. It should not be about, it shouldn't be about the state's general fund at all. It should be about repairing past harms. The way that we've enforced the cannabis laws has caused a lot of harm. It's torn families apart. People have been deported. People have spent years in jail. They've lost opportunities to work. They've lost opportunities to go to school, to have housing. It's about repairing those harms. That's what the taxes should be for. It should be going to those communities. We are all invested in doing this, because in order to move forward, you can't just say, okay, we acknowledge that there was harm, but we're moving on. You need to actually go back and repair those harms in a real way. So that's what the tax revenue should be about for marijuana legalization.
And so in thinking about that, I wonder if any of you want to talk about this. it's well and good to say theoretically that we're going to take the taxes and use them to do something reparative, reduce harm. How do you imagine that happening? Nilla, do you want to take that first, and then we can go to the others, see if they want to add to it?
I wonder if Eli and Melissa might be better equipped to answer the money question a little bit more specifically.
So I'm happy to go to Melissa because she's our go-to person for the facts. If you want to talk about the difference between the two bills, and then we can come back to the panelists and talk about what community investment looks like.
Sure. I mean, what I would want to highlight in what in this conversation is that it's not just about the revenue going back to the communities that have been harmed. It's about making starting a business and accessing the revenue that will be generated by new business accessible to folks who have historically either been criminalized for their marijuana sales or possession or growth, or who are suffering the consequences of our existing laws. So, I saw the question in the chat, and I'll let Eli and Melissa speak to it more specifically, but actually, requiring that folks of color have, fewer obstacles to being able to engage in the legal market, because we don't want to continue these like two tiers that already exist. I mean, frankly, we know that white folks and people of privilege are using marijuana without consequences, and if we don't actually address that head on, it's just going to continue.
Great. Melissa, can I turn to you? I know you're not a panelist, but could you sort of break down the tax structure issue in the two bills, and then we can get other people's feedback on this?
Sure, absolutely. And so within the Start Smart Coalition, we've been, looking at this from many different angles over years and years, and really have as the pillars of the campaign, exactly as Nilla was saying, that the people who are closest to the harm, the people who've been directly impacted, not only need to see those harm, but like restitution in terms of expungement and dealing with the entire universe of experiences that they've had that we've been speaking about before this, but also that we need to have social equity and economic justice in the way that the actual industry is going to be set up as well. So that means having license categories and a social equity incubator program, a small business incubator that'll provide technical assistance and legal counsel, and really importantly, low and zero interest loans for people who are licensed as social equity folks in the industry. Because one of the things that we've learned in terms of a lesson from other states that have preceded us in this, we, as you were saying, Charles, we're not the first by any stretch. We're now behind such luminaries as South Dakota and Montana in terms of having adult use legal access. So what can we learn from that? And one of the really crucial things is it's not enough to just have a social equity program and to have priority licensing for people who have been directly impacted by the drug war, but there also needs to be some access to capital, because we're also dealing with a situation where, because of federal prohibition, the normal access points that are already fraught with barriers and challenges for entrepreneurs of color to be able to access any sort of seed money or start capital for their businesses is almost entirely blocked off. And so the incubator program that's within the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act really seeks to be one of the first instances in the whole country, being a national model of how we actually get at that provision of resources and having low and zero interest loans from the get-go to make sure that people are able to really stand up their businesses and make a go of it. And then having the tax revenue piece be actually locked boxed for communities. So the MRTA, very different from the governor's proposal, has a community grants reinvestment fund, which would bring 50% of the revenue from taxes collected by the state into that fund that would then be available for community-based efforts and for local nonprofits and other entities that are working around issues of, youth development and after-school programs, reentry services for people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system, nutritional support services, housing. It's really meant to be responsive to all of the harms that we've seen play out at the community level from the marijuana arrest crusade and from the drug war. generally speaking. And the governor's bill just doesn't have that. It has some lip service around a social equity fund, but it's at a much, much lower threshold, and it's capped at a specific dollar amount that increases incrementally, but only ever reaches a very small fraction of what the state is going to see in terms of cannabis tax revenue. So, from our perspective, having an actual guaranteed percentage, if we're talking about $350 million on an annual basis into the state, having 50% of that after program costs are accounted for is a sizable amount of money. And to be able to have that coming back into communities for things that are consistently on the chopping block or just aren't even included in the budget at all, because the excuse is always, oh, well, the dollars ran out, sorry. And what we're saying is that's, number one, it's inexcusable in general, but also as we're having this new influx of revenue coming into the state, those have to absolutely be the things that are prioritized.
And Melissa, on top of that, I believe the MRTA doesn't just set aside the money for those communities. It allows the communities to make the decision about what happens with the funds to a certain extent.
Yeah, to a degree. So the MRTA actually sets out a process where people who have been directly impacted by the drug war would be able to be part of the steering committee or the advisory committee that's established to be able to determine, how those grants should be paid out. So it's really about having that accountability woven all the way through the process and making sure that the people who have been impacted by the drug war have a voice and are able to lead some of these efforts in conjunction with the state entity as well.
So if I could, I want to bring Michael into this. He already introduced the idea of homegrown. One of the things about the governor's bill is that it has this very cumbersome set of tracking systems that are going to mean expensive technology and it's seed to sale kind of tracking systems. And this is why I wanted to call on you, Michael. I could see you shaking your head already. I know Rhode Island had a very different approach for how it wanted to deal with this. So you want to jump in there before I kick this back to Melissa?
Yeah, and I really, every system has advantages and flaws. One of the things that I really appreciated about Rhode Island's system was the reciprocity law. A lot of folks don't know this, but Rhode Island as a state recognizes the validity of anybody from outside the state to have access to their program while they're in state because of the federal travel restrictions that can pose a real burden on folks. So legalization alleviates a lot of that for patients who are visiting New York for either family or for recreational purposes. That way they're able to maintain access. When I traveled to Las Vegas, that was certainly a benefit, right? And when I went to Colorado for my ski trip just a few months ago, I didn't have to worry about flying with my medicine on a plane and potentially getting in trouble and like all these, barriers that crop up because I can just go to the store like a normal human being and buy my medicine and go to my timeshare and then go use my skis or whatever, but the way that Rhode Island handles it, I think is great. They have a means tested access program for folks who are on Medicare or Medicaid. The DVR provides tags to your caregiver, or if you're a home grower, they'll provide you with your tags at no expense whatsoever. And it's $25 a year for a caregiver to be able to provide caregiving services. And it's 12 plants in the flowering cycle, 12 plants in the vegetative cycle, with up to 24 plants that are in a cloning stage, so they're not in vegetative or flowering. And that conforms to the federal limits, which are 99 plants under the federal law. So that there would still be some requirements there. But I did want to touch a little bit on community reinvestment because there's some really important talking points. I mean, the restitution and expungement is essential. The establishment of a minority-run and minority-owned business fund. Certainly people who are directly impacted with criminal records should be a priority. A post-secondary education fund. This is something that doesn't go away when we legalize, right? People who have had criminal records, who received those charges while receiving federal aid, even if it was for cannabis. We now recognize cannabis to be legal. They might not still be able to access those funds to be able to return to school. We should be able to provide as a state an alternative for people who aren't eligible for federal financial aid, provide them with a pathway towards citizenship and post-secondary education, better equip our workforce. We want to be competitive as a state. We want to be, having a high earning workforce. Criminal records are something that drive down our taxes on a systemic level because people aren't earning the revenues that they should be earning and paying tax on those revenues. It's an indirect way of approaching this idea of bolstering our taxes. Having a research fund, because federal research is still restricted. And so, having some money that's dedicated to advancing research around cannabis, and having a community education campaign that's funded to reduce the stigma around cannabis and inform the community of the risks, of the benefits. We have very, very little research as far as the benefits of cannabis or other drugs for that matter. Very limited research on what they do to optimize human health or improve quality of life. And I think that having more research to tilt the scale towards understanding a more compassionate understanding of use is really helpful. Increasing basic needs, housing access, food security, grant programs for patients, so we have means tested access. I think that's super important. And then supporting harm reduction and recovery, which could include funding for on-the-job training programs for people to have, there was a large cut this year in people to become scholarship to get trained as recovery coaches. Like, we could reverse that. We could be reinvesting in those types of licenses and positions and professionalizing our community so people can have not only a living wage job, but a thriving wage job. Even if they've had a criminal record, even if they've been arrested and currently use cannabis, that shouldn't preclude people from these kinds of opportunities. We have an opportunity to reinvest this money in a way that's going to look really good for the long-term outlook for our state. I think it's sensible that we consider all of those avenues.
Definitely. And so much of what you touched on, Michael, is included in the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. The fact that, talking about actually having resources for research, that's in there, having the resources for the public education about the plant is, certainly part of that proposal, as well as having 25% of the revenue going to drug treatment and education, and with specific language around harm reduction, and being really clear that we need to be centering harm reduction within our efforts and within our conversations around this. So I want to bring us, I know we're kind of moving toward the final phase of our conversation tonight. And, I just want to come back to each one of you and say, with our audience listening right now, we've talked through so many of the pros and cons and what's actually on the table right now within New York State, knowing that we're barreling toward the April 1st budget deadline. What can people actually do who are listening? How can folks tap in? How can they be part of, whether they're coming at it from the medical marijuana patient side of things, whether they're coming at it from a community member side, or somebody who might have been impacted themselves or want to participate in the market? What can people actually do right now to shape what New York actually does in terms of legalization? Eli, again, you're like indicating, so I'm going to come to you.
Well, I'll say one easy thing to do. I'm going to put this link in the chat for everybody, but this is the Start Smart Action tool. You can click on that website. It'll allow you to email and call your legislators, and as well as the Speaker of the Assembly and the Majority Leader of the Senate and Governor Cuomo's offices, and tell them you support the MRTA. And they keep track of every single phone call, every single email. So even if you don't speak with a person, it actually really matters. Just the act of reaching out and saying, I support the MRTA, not the governor's proposal. Speaking from experience this past summer, dealing with police transparency litigation, repealing of 50A. I don't know if people have heard of that, but the point being that the number of emails and calls really pushed that legislation over and got it passed. So it really does matter, every individual person that makes a call, that reaches out. If you're interested in supporting marijuana justice, the much better proposal, we're at a point where it seems inevitable that legalization is going to happen. It's not a matter of if, It's a matter of how. So, and we're at crunch time. So I think it's so important to let your representatives know where you stand on this issue. And just one more distinction that Michael brought up, and is if you have a felony conviction for drugs, you may not be able to get a license under the governor's plan. So that's one glaring huge problem, is that you could be actually removed from eligibility for a license to sell if you've got a conviction for previously selling. The MRTA doesn't have that same bar.
Anybody else want to jump in on this? I mean, I know each one of you are organizing within your organizations, within the various coalitions that you're a part of too. What else can people do to raise their voices, or what are some of the specific points that folks should be communicating back to their legislators about what's really important for New York to get right here?
Well, I can certainly contribute that, New York does have the benefit of having one of the oldest and well-organized drug users unions in the United States, and that's Vocal New York. And it's really important for people who have stories, who have lived experience, who are drug users, but maybe not the most impacted. Maybe they're not the most marginalized. Maybe they're professionals or folks like myself, but maybe they haven't found the courage to come out and tell their story yet, to get involved, even if it's through donations, whether it's through direct advocacy. I can tell you that one of the most powerful experiences I had was when the governor of Rhode Island turned out their legalization proposal 2 years ago when I was there. And it was even worse than the governor's proposal here in New York. It essentially proposed to prop up a state-run monopoly. They wanted to escalate, they wanted to ban socialization of cannabis completely, in direct violation of our basic rights as guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. Really, really awful stuff. And we filled all 3 floors of the State House, and we shut that bill down in the House Finance Committee. And that bill, that budget was not approved because of the direct advocacy and the immense turnout of the people who are advocating for this. And I could say that the same thing can happen in New York, and it's so much easier now. You don't have to go to the State House. All you gotta do is sign up on your computer or on your phone, and you just jump in and you tell your little bit, and you can put it on your desk, and you can hang out. And if you're a pot smoker like me, you can light up a joint while you're waiting even, and then give your bit and then call it a day. But it makes a difference. Right? We have the ability to shape how cannabis legalization happens here in New York. Let's not follow suit with New Jersey. Let's do it the right way. Let's give New Yorkers something proud, something to write home about. We are the California of the East Coast. It's long been said, and it's time we just act like it. Let's show up and let's make this thing happen.
I just want to echo and highlight both that in my experience speaking directly to legislators or their staff, they know that legalization is coming. They are not always attuned to the difference between these 2 laws. And the difference is huge. I can't, I think we've emphasized, but I can't emphasize enough how different they are on the criminal front, on the medical front, on the money, the revenue front. So calling, people want you to call their legislators to do lots of things, but really naming the MRTA over the governor's legislation is so, so vital, because I think it's happening. We're gonna get to legalization, but we have to do it the right way. And the one thing I'll end on is represent parents who have prescriptions for marijuana and have medical marijuana cards now, and we can't seem to prove to the government that their use is still legal, responsible, whatever it is. And I think the MRTA goes a long way to name that we're decriminalizing something, we're destigmatizing something, and we're making it, we're normalizing it, and we're doing that the right way, and really being able to be transparent from medical providers to their patients, to their employers, to the people they're seeking housing from, to all of these avenues of people's lives. This has to be the way we do it. Otherwise, we will be back here talking about the ways in which the governor's legislation are continuing to harm communities of color. and poor communities.
Right?
Yeah, I want to point out about the some of the difference between, we talked about the MRTA a lot, but the CRTA, one of the things that really struck me about the governor's bill is that by the time you finish levying the taxes that he wanted to levy, the cost of cannabis would be much higher in a dispensary than it would be on the street. So it's really, you know, it sounds like he would love to raise all this money, and it sounds wonderful on paper when you put the tax, the effective tax rate and you apply it. But when in reality, will anybody go to a dispensary and buy cannabis if it's cheaper to buy it from the guy on the corner? Perhaps not. So then, you know, then what are we left with? We're really left with a program that's difficult to implement, that doesn't raise the tax revenue that they're talking about. Yeah, I would like to see it benefit society at large, and it's good that we have, you know, we have good intentions, but big companies will come in and take all of the revenue away, whatever revenue that there is, and it doesn't support the human right. I agree with the human right that we should be able to grow our own plants. It's a plant, and yes, it could be limited, and yes, it can be regulated, but there is something very, the opposite end of that. The CRTA is the fact that patients should have the right to grow their own medicine and heal themselves. And there's no happy medium in that bill. So if the MRTA really takes into account that human right and the rights of social justice, and we can have something that could be implemented, as opposed to the CRTA that really sounds like he's setting it up to fail from the get-go, so nobody's going to buy in a legal dispensary. So that's one of the reasons why one might want to point out when they call their representatives some of the benefits of the MRTA over the CRTA. Like, it probably will go through, but how are we going to pass this thing and make it viable?
So that actually sets us up to, we do have some questions from our audience and want to get to them. And one of the things that it has been on my mind this whole evening as I'm listening to you all talk so much common sense, and New York likes to brag that we lead, you know, what's taken us so long to make this happen? And that leads to the first question in the chat. Are there any notable barriers to having the MRTA passed into law? And the second question that we can talk to well as part of that, the second part of that question is asking about the time frame for all of this to happen. Melissa, I'll punt that to you, but I want to hear folk opine about what are the barriers to passing the MRTA. Anybody want to jump in? Tanya, you're on mute. If you could unmute, that would be really great. There you go.
Well, I think some of the barriers are that I think the governor, as I said, is just, so to some extent not looking at the numbers, and looks like he's being greedy. So I worry also about the governor's state of affairs, and if he'll be the one to pass the budget in a couple of weeks. So I'm crossing my fingers on that one. We'll see what happens with that. But I think some of the barriers are that we have to recognize that there is opposition, and if people, it looks like it's going to go through. Sometimes one of the barriers can just be complacency. It looks like, you know, we're a victim of our own success, but it won't be successful if we don't make our desires known that the MRTA is a stronger bill over the CRTA. Yes, we'll likely to get cannabis, but, you know, for adult use, but how will that be implemented? It really depends, and I think we need to make our voices heard.
But Melissa, I want to kind of bring you into this because you've been tracking this, and we've had 2 years of history where we thought we were going to get across, and it ultimately failed. You want to talk about that and also talk about the timeline here?
Sure. I mean, I think Tanya's exactly right that there is a degree of people thinking that because, you know, we've seen the decriminalization bill that moved through in 2019, because we've seen, you know, some shifts in our societal approach, although clearly not enough, and the fact that the governor has had this in the budget for the past few years, the legislature's had their position. I think there's this sort of assumption that like, it's going to happen, it's totally fine. And we can't take that for granted, especially in this moment. We need people really raising your voice, as Eli was saying earlier, contacting your elected officials, especially Senate Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins and Assembly Speaker Carl Heastie. They're going to be the leaders who, bring this forward. If it moves within the budget, they're going to be the ones, the three people in the room, with the governor, really hashing out the final parameters and the final details. And so they need to hear not only that people want to see marijuana justice, but also that we want to see these specific provisions really explicitly taken care of within the legislation, as folks have been highlighting tonight. And the timeline is, very much immediate. We're in the final push with the possibility that this could happen anytime really from here to April 1st. We know that conversations are, proceeding at a furious pace right now. And so this is precisely the moment for people to just be ringing the phones off the hook, to be sending emails, to be tweeting your legislators, to be tweeting your own networks and friends and people who care about seeing this done the right way in New York as well. And one of the things that the bill sponsors have always highlighted and that we talked about a little bit here tonight is it doesn't have to be the fact that you want to consume yourself. It doesn't have to be that you have been directly impacted necessarily, but this is something that, because of the broad touch points within the entire sphere that touches on cannabis, really everybody has a stake in this. Whether we're talking about making sure that the community reinvestment piece is done right, and we actually have revenue, we actually have budget that we can use toward things that we want to see all across the state in communities. That's something that everybody should really be raising their voice about right now as well. So I'll pause there, and I want to make sure that we have space to get other folks in this too.
So go ahead, Eli, and then
Yeah.
I'm gonna be politically incorrect here.
Okay, well, I was just going to say, in terms of the delay and just in terms of, I've been working on this for the last 3 years and been up to Albany and talking to legislators and about this. And I think that there is a lack of urgency from people who don't feel the consequences of the laws. And people in power are the ones who are feeling the least consequences. A lot of people feel like, what, marijuana is pretty much legalized for me. I don't have any problems with it, especially people that are in power. And so I think that lack of urgency, that delay, in part comes from the fact that a lot of people in privileged positions are not feeling what prohibition means. They're not feeling it on a daily basis. They're not seeing it play out in people's lives. And when you do see that, I think you realize this needs to happen now. Each year that this happens, somebody gets deported, families get torn apart, people get arrested for marijuana. They're doing buy-in busts. The NYPD is out there doing marijuana targeted sales like last week. So the urgency is something that not everybody's feeling, but it's real. So I just wanted to contribute that.
So Eli, you actually contributed part of what I wanted to say. So thank you for putting that out there. I also think it's important to be really frank and say that much as our governor likes to posture himself as a progressive and an innovator, historically, when it has come anything touching on drugs, he's been far more comfortable being a law and order guy. And so, we've been kind of pressed to this. Legalization is happening in every state bordering on New York. And so there's a desire not to see the tax revenues leave the state. There's a recognition that it's kind of inevitable. But I think it's fair to say that the bill he has put forward is pretty regressive. And if you look at what should be the lessons learned from other jurisdictions, we haven't learned them in the governor's version of the bill, whereas the other version really does try to address them. Eli, if I could, I just want to ask you, someone asked a very specific question about the impact on people of color and disproportionate penalties. So you might want to address that in terms of the two different versions of the bill.
Right. And I think that, and it's a really good question, because I think that the question was about, even after you legalize in these other states like Colorado and Washington, the arrests are still disproportionately for people of color. So there's two ways you can address this. One is to have as few criminal penalties as possible for marijuana. And the MRTA goes farther than I think either of those other states did in terms of actually getting rid of criminal laws for marijuana, increasing the amount that you can possess. So that's one way, is just to get rid of criminal penalties. And the MRTA does a really good job with that, much better than the governor's bill, certainly, and even better than those other states. I would say, honestly, the other way is to reform police. And I would say to defund the police. And that's a whole different conversation, but this is a policing problem that we don't just see with marijuana. We see it with all sorts of offenses. And it's not like people are getting arrested for the same behavior at the same rates. People of color get arrested across the board more.
I was just going to add to tie in, I think, what everyone's been saying, which is that there's a comfort with the way we use our laws around marijuana use, but drug use generally, in surveilling and punishing communities of color and poor communities. And the governor's legislation reflects that. There's no, it's just very clear that there's no desire to change that, to use marijuana use or possession as a pretext to stop people and search people, to arrest them, to harass them, to separate their families, all these consequences. People with privilege are comfortable with that. And I think if, us here, speak for myself, people listening, if you're uncomfortable with that, it's a reason to get out there and call your legislature and ask for this legislation, because it's not just about access to legal marijuana, which is super important, but it's also for not giving the police or the state this tool to discriminate.
That's exactly right, Nilla. And I think that's really important to highlight. The fact that we even have marijuana prohibition in the first place was never about the plant. It was never about the pharmacology. It was never about anything other than being able to weaponize these drug laws and being able to weaponize prohibition in order to maintain segregation, in order to maintain the sorts of control that the state was trying to exercise. And so as we're looking to move out of that framework and to really turn the page, we can't have a Prohibition 2.0 framework. That's purely unacceptable. We have to actually transform what our approach is and actually base it on science, actually base it on what real community safety and well-being looks like. And that means, shifting resources away from criminalization, investing back in communities, but first and foremost, acknowledging that this was never about the plant. It never was. The LaGuardia Commission back more than 75 years ago determined that, basically all of the open-ended questions that people are still, arm wrestling about in Albany, and, going back to the question, Charles, about why hasn't this happened in the past, the sort of red herrings that are thrown up over and over again, when in fact, again, like the LaGuardia Commission back 75 years ago said, like, these really aren't things that should hold us up in this area. These aren't evidence-based factors. And if we are looking at, why this is still on the books and why we haven't seen policies move forward, it's exactly the things that Eli and Nilla were raising here and that Michael and Tanya have previously around stigma, around the ways in which marijuana has been used as a tool. And we know that legalization in and of itself isn't going to remove racism in our society, but it removes a tool, it removes a justification. And as much as we can add in really intentionally the sort of protections and the guardrails that we need to see, especially in terms of marijuana, if that's what we're legalizing, that's what has to be on the table. And, just again, reinforcing that's what the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act does. The governor's proposal really keeps it very much within the same frame of what we've seen in the past.
Very important to hear. So we're coming to the end of our time. For all of you who have been participating in this, I want to thank you for coming in, being a part of the conversation. I want to note to everyone that Eli Northrop did put in the chat the one link you need. So if you haven't copied it, please go copy it now, so that you can take action. And I would urge you not just to take action yourself, but share it through social media, share the link on Twitter, share it with your friends, encourage everyone to take some ownership for making this happen. And with that, I want to thank all of our panelists who spent the evening with us. Eli, Tanya, Nilla, and Michael, thank you so much for being a part of this. And I especially want to thank Melissa and the Drug Policy Alliance for co-sponsoring tonight's forum with the New York State Harm Reduction Association. So with that, I want to bid everybody a good night. And we host these forums about once a month. So be on the lookout, because we'll have another exciting forum coming up soon. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Charles. And
Thanks,
thank you
everyone.
everybody
Thanks for having
us.
Thank you.